Hello, everyone. My name is Diana Wall, and I'm the director of the School of Global Environmental Sustainability at Colorado State University, and I'm the chairperson of this National Academies Study Committee. In my role as chair of the study and as moderator of this committee meeting, pardon me, I'd like to welcome everyone here on Zoom. And to those of you watching the live stream, welcome. And all of you who may be watching this recording later. The task being undertaken by the committee of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine is to explore the linkages between soil health and human health. The committee's full statement of tasks can be found on the study website, which is under the link of project to the right of the embedded video of this meeting. I'd like to give you some sense of the agenda for today. I'm giving the welcome. Then we will have Kara Laney, the study director with the National Academies, who's going to provide a brief overview of the study process. And following her presentation, I will introduce our speakers for today. To start, I want to note that this is an open, on-the-record session. Interested individuals and members of the press have been invited to join us as observers. This is not a this is not a news conference, however, and we will not be entertaining questions from the audience. Reporters who would like to talk with members of the committee are kindly asked to touch base with the staff officer, Kara Laney, and also anyone who wanted to provide a written comment or a document to the committee is welcome to do so by clicking the Provide Feedback link on the right side of the study website. You can also subscribe for updates about the study by signing on to the National Academies Board on Agriculture and Natural Resources listserv, also on the right side of the page. I'd also like to remind everyone that this is an information gathering session. I ask everyone to be extremely mindful of the fact that the committee has made no conclusions and that it would be a mistake for anyone to leave the meeting today thinking otherwise. Comments made by members of the committee should not, or any individual should not be interpreted any individual on the committee should not be interpreted as positions of the committee or the academies. In addition, committee members typically ask probing questions in these information gathering sessions that may not be indicative of their personal views. The committee will deliberate thoroughly before writing its draft report. Moreover, once the report is written, it must go through a rigorous review by experts who are anonymous to the committee. And the committee must then respond to the comments of this review with appropriate revisions that adequately satisfy the Academy's Report Review Committee and the National Academy of Sciences president before it is considered an official Academy's report. This committee is comprised of 15 volunteer experts that you see on your screen. You'll find a short biography of each member on our study website. I'd now like to turn things over to Kara Laney, the Senior Program Officer with the Board on Agriculture and Natural Resources at the National Academies and the study director for this activity. Kara?
Thanks, Diana. I just want to give a brief overview of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine and our study process to anyone who may be joining us today for the first time and have not as much familiarity with the institution. The National Academy of Sciences was established in a bill passed by Congress and signed into law by President Lincoln in 1863. Later, the Academy was also granted the authority under an executive order to establish the National Academy of Engineering in 1964 and the Institute of Medicine in 1970, which today is known as the National Academy of Medicine. Together, we're the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and we consist of these 3 honorific academies, as well as the work of scientists across the country, inside and outside of these bodies, who provide expert advice to the nation on issues involving science, engineering, and medicine. The mission detailed in our congressional charter is to investigate, examine, experiment, and report upon any subject of science or art whenever called upon by the government. We fulfill this mission through many convening activities, including consensus studies like the one we are here today to talk about. Just to share a little bit more about our consensus studies as opposed to other convening activities that we hold, such as workshops and forums. Consensus studies are conducted by committees convened specifically for a unique statement of task. The experts who serve on these committees do so as individuals, not as representatives of any organization or institution to which they may belong. They also serve as volunteers. Consensus study committees review the state of the scientific literature to write a report that responds to the problem identified in their statement of task. The report will hopefully be used to shape sound policies, inform public opinion, and advance the pursuit of the scientific field in question. Each consensus study goes through a number of stages. First, the statement of task is defined between conversations between the National Academies and the study sponsor. In this case, the study sponsor is USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Next, the National Academy seeks nominations for individuals that have the requisite expertise needed to address the statement of task. And each committee should be comprised of a balance of individuals with the appropriate range of expertise and a balance of perspective on the task's questions. The nominees are appointed to the committee by the president of the National Academy of Sciences, Dr. Marcia McNutt, and their committee membership is provisional until a discussion of conflict of interest, disclosures, and composition has been completed at their first meeting. After being appointed, the committee moves into its information gathering phase, which we are actually wrapping up today. The committee invites in speakers to present either in person or via Zoom. Members of the public may also submit information for the committee to consider, and as it gathers information, the committee will begin to deliberate on how to best address the statement of task. They then begin working on drafting a report, and when that draft is complete, the document must be reviewed, and the committee must revise the report as needed in response to those reviewer comments. The National Academy's Report Review Committee determines whether the reviewer comments have been adequately addressed and then approves the report for release. The final report is then delivered to the sponsor and made publicly available. Today, we are meeting in open session. That means in addition to the committee and the speakers, anyone from the public may attend. And in the times when we meet in person, anybody may attend the meetings in person as well. We call this open session. The committee also meets in closed session, at which time only the committee and members of the staff of the National Academies are present. We meet in closed session so that the committee can deliberate about its statement of task and devise the best plan to address it. This is their next slide is the general timeline for this study on soil health and human health. This is our last information gathering session. I anticipate the draft report will be ready for review later this fall or early in 2024, and that the final report will be publicly released in the spring of 2024. This is the committee's statement of task. It's a bit lengthy, so I'll pause for a moment for everyone to read it. You can also find it on the study's website. And if you go to the next slide, Kat. As I mentioned before, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's National Institute of Food and Agriculture is the sponsor for this study, and it came from a request directed by the by Congress in a recent appropriations legislation. Lastly, this is a screenshot of the study's website. On the left, you can see tabs for the full statement of task, the committee membership, and their biographies. On the right, there's a link to provide feedback about the study or comments, and a place to subscribe for updates about the study. If you need to connect with the National Academy staff for the study, here's my address as well as that of my colleague, Catherine Kane. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Diana.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, it's now my pleasure, and apologies for my voice. It's now my pleasure to introduce the first speaker this afternoon. That's Donna McCallister. She's an assistant professor at Texas Tech University and the Department of Agriculture and Applied Economics. She got her PhD in 2014, I believe, from Texas Tech. And she has a varied interest in areas related to water and food scarcity, water policy, and the sustainability of agricultural production. Donna, we look forward to hearing your presentation today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. So today I'm going to be talking about the barriers to adoption from a producer perspective, and I'm going to be using the Texas High Plains as a case study. So when I start talking about sustainability, I think it's important to define what I mean by that term because there are literally hundreds of different definitions. So this legal definition by the USDA states that sustainable agriculture is an integrated system of plant and animal production practices. So even burping cows are sustainable with a site-specific application. So that term site-specific is really important because we need to realize that sustainability is not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to prescriptive practices. So what is sustainable in the upper Midwest is certainly not going to be sustainable for us in West Texas. And so it's important to keep that in mind as we have this discussion. So sustainable agriculture should be able to satisfy all of our human food and fiber needs. We should be able to improve our environment. We should make the most efficient use of our non-renewable resources. So the water resources in Texas comes from the Ogallala Aquifer, and it is a non-renewable resource. But what this is talking about is conservation, not preservation. So those are two completely different things. So as we move through this conversation, we have these non-renewable resources, but we should be able to use them in an efficient manner. So we should be able to sustain the economic viability of our growers, our rural farming communities. And this definition is largely built on the three-pillar rule of social sustainability. So that's talking about fair labor laws and animal health and welfare. And then we have this environmental piece. So that's where the soil health, human health, increasing biodiversity comes into play. And then we have the economic piece, which I think is the most important, being an economist, but for a producer to remain sustainable, they have to be profitable in the long run. So Texas has one of the largest diverse agricultural production, probably in the United States. We grow a variety of crops from cotton to corn, sorghum, wheat, peanuts. We have vineyards. We also grow alternative crops like guar and hemp. But cotton is our #1 cash crop, particularly in the Texas High Plains. So the Texas High Plains is located in the Texas Panhandle. And we actually are only 40% irrigated. So 60% of our acres are actually dry land. Weather is our most limiting factor. We only receive about 18 inches of annual rainfall every year. And so that creates a cap on our production for cotton at about 1,000 pounds per acre and for irrigated cotton, and about 500 pounds per acre for our dry land. So as I mentioned before, we receive our rainfall is limited. So we really rely on water resources from the Ogallala Aquifer to supplement our irrigation. And you can see from the figure here that the Ogallala Aquifer stretches from the Texas High Plains all the way to Nebraska. The portion of Nebraska is largely a non-renewable, or is a renewable resource, because they haven't seen a lot of substantial change in their water availability over time. It is largely rechargeable there. But as you move further south, you can start to see more and more red. And that red represents more than a 50% change in saturated thickness from pre-development. So since the 1950s, we've lost over half of the available water in the aquifer. And most of this is used in irrigated agriculture. So this has necessitated some change from our growers. So no longer do we have full irrigation capacity, but we are having to implement cover crops, crop rotations, and other best management practices to conserve the water resources that we do have. Because we have limited amount of rainfall, we are also prone to drought. And this really represents the nexus of soil and human health for us. If we do not receive adequate rainfall in the springtime, then we can't get our cover crops up. And if we can't get our crops up, we have no ground cover. And then we get giant haboobs. I don't know if you've ever heard of a haboob, but it is an overall encompassing dust storm that was pretty prevalent during the Dust Bowl days of the 40s. This is a video from a haboob taken in 2011, which was one of the worst droughts that we've ever had in our history. And it literally will block out the sun because the dirt blows so horribly. But I always say that women in West Texas have the best skin because the dirt acts as a natural exfoliant. But it does present some pretty severe health concerns for us living in this area. So the main reason we plant cover crops is for that wind erosion. So this is a figure of irrigated cotton yields from 1980 to 2018. So you can see between 1980 and 2000, there really was no significant trend in irrigated yields during that time. But we had something significant happen in 2001, which created a structural shift in our cotton supply. So we started from that 2001 to 2018. You can really see that increasing trend line. Despite the drought that we had in 2011, the 1980 to 2000 average for irrigated agriculture in our area was about 500 pounds per acre. And with the structural shift that happened in 2001, we've actually doubled our cotton yields during that time, even looking at the drought year that we had here in 2011, which still outperformed the 1980 to 2000 average. So in 2001, we had FiberMax Roundup Ready cottonseed varieties came out, which literally changed the game in terms of our production. So although we are seeing a reduced capacity for our irrigation, we are able to do more with less. And so to me, I think that this is a success story for the region because we are utilizing technological advancements to improve our production practices. So the concept of sustainability is 100% market driven. This is a figure that dictates the generations that we have currently in the market. We have the silent generation. It's not very active. We have boomers that are born between 1946 and 1964. They are entering the age of retirement. We have Gen Xers born between 65 and 80. And then we have millennials born between 1981 and 1996. Millennials make up the bulk of our workforce currently. The brands and retailers have developed specific marketing strategies for millennials, but that does not work on Gen Z, born between 1997 and 2012. So there is a difference in the generations. Gen Z does not currently have any market purchasing power yet, but they will. And the brands and retailers are already beginning to focus their marketing towards specifically this generation. A Nielsen survey asked consumers if they would prefer to buy from sustainable brands. And 62% of millennials and 62% of Generation Zers said that they would. And then they said, okay, well, would you be willing to pay more for sustainable products? 68% of millennials and 73% of Generation Zs said that they would pay more. So in economics, we have a term that's called stated versus revealed preferences. So I might state as a consumer that I have a preference for purchasing organic or sustainable products, but when I get to the register, I might reveal that actually I don't. So when it comes time for me to put my money where my mouth is, I might reveal that I don't really have that preference. But what we're seeing in the market is that consumers really do have this preference for sustainably produced goods. And so if we take a look at Gen Z, there are specific things that have happened to shape a generation. For millennials, it was the advent of the internet. It was cell phones. It was 9/11. And Gen Z is a generation that has been completely immersed in technology from the very beginning. So that makes them very social justice oriented. And their biggest issues are climate change, gun violence, cyberbullying. And so what we're seeing now is that they are putting pressure on the brands and retailers to say, listen, we don't want you to use just carbon offsets. We really want to see a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions over time. And so you need to put your money where your mouth is as a brand, as a retailer, and you need to make investments into your operation to reduce your gas emissions. And so this is really starting to have an impact on the cotton industry and our cotton producers. So we know from for a consumer perspective that they do want sustainable products. So now we have to document that at the field level. So this is where some of these voluntary sustainability programs come into play. So we have a couple that I'm going to talk about with regard to cotton, but there are a lot more out there that I'm not touching on. But we have BCI, we have the U.S. Cotton Trust Protocol, and then there's Field to Market, which is the benchmarking platform that is typically used. So the cotton industry got together and said, okay, we have some industry goals that we want to meet. We want to increase our soil carbon. We want to increase our land use efficiency, which is basically a proxy for crop yield. We want to make sure that we're decreasing our greenhouse gas emissions and soil loss, water use, energy use over time. And so in order to meet these industry goals, they created the U.S. Cotton Trust Protocol, which is very similar to BCI, the Better Cotton Initiative. It is a voluntary program that was designed to help the industry reach its goals. It's a voluntary program. Producers have to enter in their data into a field platform called the Field to Market platform. It's time consuming, but they put all of their field level data in it, and then it analyzes that data for sustainability. So they enter in their data into the protocol. It's reviewed by a second and third party verifiers. And so hopefully the goal is that we get enough producer participation that we can prove to consumers that we really are being sustainable by benchmarking our field level practices. So we do that using this field print calculator. And it looks at 8 different metrics at the field level. And this is strictly for benchmarking so that brands and retailers can say to those consumers, yes, we really are purchasing a product that is sustainably produced. And something interesting to note for the industry is that we have the country of Brazil is entirely BCI certified, and I think they make up of 25% of the total supply chain for cotton. So it's really becoming an important issue to get our growers on board. So I have had some research funded by the USDA, and I created a grower survey to ask what the barriers to adoption were for using some of the climate smart agricultural practices, so cover crops, crop rotations, no-till, practices like that. And then I wanted to see if growers would be willing to accept a certain dollar amount to participate or to grow those particular or use those particular practices in their management. And then if we did create a contract with the brands and retailers, what would that contract look like? So there's a whole bunch of information from the survey. I'm just kind of jumping to the meat of kind of what we found. But we asked growers, okay, what sustainable practices are you currently using at the field level? We had 17, so we had about 160 responses total. The average age was 45, which is fairly young considering the average age of our growers across the United States. But 17 of our producers were using honeybees, 45 using IPM, 64 were doing terracing, cover crops, crop rotations, no-till representing the bulk of sustainable practices currently used. And then we asked, okay, what challenges do you feel like are facing your operation moving forward? Most of them had to deal with maximizing profit and crop yield. We had some, say, farm succession, declining water availability, and then soil preservation and health. We had 79 responses for that. Of the 160 respondents that we had, we asked them, okay, how many of you are enrolled in a sustainability program? And 28 of them were. So we said, okay, well, how do you feel about that program? What's your satisfaction? And most of them said, yeah, it's great. We have no problems. We like it. We'll continue to do it. Of the producers that were not participating in sustainability programs, we said, well, why aren't you? So what are the barriers to adoption into this for you? And the majority of respondents said they were scared of their information being used against them. There was potential exposure of their identifiable information. Some of them just didn't want to share their data, or there was a lack of general interest. And then most people felt like entering their data was very time consuming and they just didn't have the time for that. Then I asked a question, do you anticipate that the market will force you to consider implementing sustainable practices in your operation? And the majority of respondents said that they felt like that was a possibility. 12% said definitely yes, 37% said probably yes, and 40% said maybe. So I felt like that was very telling from a producer perspective. The one thing that we don't want to see happen is a negative impact. The government to force producers to do certain things. So we don't want them to say, well, you can't get your federal crop insurance unless you are using a cover crop, or we won't let you market your cotton through this marketing firm unless you are voluntarily participating in a sustainability program. So I think producers are aware of the negative consequences of this, and they are leery of what could potentially happen. This is something that it's like a train that's in motion. And so we know it's something that they are going to have to deal with. And we just need to make sure that we are taking care of the growers as we progress through this. So this is really the meat of the survey that we asked, would you accept $5 an acre to incorporate cover crops into your operation? If they said yes, we said, okay, would you accept a lower amount? Would you accept $2.50? If they said no, we asked a higher amount. Would you accept $10 an acre? And our overall willingness to accept was $6. And that was pretty telling because since most of the respondents in the survey were already using cover crops, they would be willing to accept any amount additional to help them out as an incentive payment. I did this survey, something similar for another survey, and we had a higher population age. It was closer to 65, and their willingness to accept was about $30 an acre, which makes sense because as someone who's entering retirement, you probably don't want to make that investment into their operation if it's not something that they're already doing. So for the younger crowd, I think they're very willing and open, and it probably wouldn't take a lot for them to get there. So we asked for contracting, what would your optimal contract look like and how much would you accept? So the results that we found was that producers would accept $16 a bale or $5 an acre as kind of a general or an average willingness to accept to participate in an incentive. So the protocol requires 10% of your acres to be enrolled. So if a grower is going 3 bales to the acre, they would have 750 acres to enroll. So that would be $36,000 at $16 a bale. And that's not a small sum. So that is quite a large incentive payment to, I think, get grower buy-in. They also said that crop insurance rebates would be desirable as a supplemental benefit. They actually preferred 0 supplemental benefit to more grower training. Which I thought was really funny. And then they preferred short-term contracts with industry verification. So someone that knows them, someone that knows the industry versus a third party or the government. So just some takeaway points here. I think that producers are willing and open to market-based incentives to implement climate smart practices at the field level. We need to make sure that we are structuring them appropriately and that we're not hurting the grower. But I think that moving toward these practices may have positive impacts on a grower's bottom line, but they may also have negative impacts. And so that's where the regionality comes into play. So I think we need to be careful about assigning prescriptive practices versus, paying for results. And then I really think that contracting directly with brands and retailers, at least in terms of cotton production, could help provide larger incentives and thus create larger grower buy-in. So that's really all I have for you today. Be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Donna, for that nice presentation. It was very interesting. I'll open the floor now for the committee if we have any questions from the committee members? And please raise your hand. I see one hand going up, Ilka.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really interesting presentation. So it seems like you're arguing mostly for consumer-driven incentives. Can you think of any governmental or state incentives or requirements that we maybe should consider as recommendations in this report?
Well, I think that there's been a lot of income flowing into USDA for these climate smart agricultural programs. And so I know that the federal dollars are kind of trickling into the sustainability programs. So the protocol received a grant, a climate smart commodities grant, to actually provide incentive payments. So I think they were, I don't remember off the top of my head, but a max of $3,500 per grower for 5 years to join that sustainability program. But the problem is, I think what happens is that it's only for a short amount of time. So we really want to create a behavioral change. We want to do it for the long term. And so I think the question is, how can we get grower buy-in and create a permanent impact in the market? And so I think in order to do that, it'll have to come from industry. But I do know that USDA is like partially funding, some of those incentives programs. So.
Thank you.
Rebecca.
Thanks so much for that presentation, Donna. I'm kind of struggling with, I think, the respectable conservation versus preservation and market versus other, these distinctions. So, and especially in the context of the aquifer depletion issue. So like if the customers of Texas cotton are not in Texas, they're not necessarily motivated by the fact that you're going to run out of water in Texas. And so if your conservation approach is more economic conservation and you're not preserving the aquifer, at some point you're just not going to be able to, the industry is just going to collapse. It seems really in the existential interest of the industry to get out ahead of anybody in order to be able to actually have water. So like, how do
I understand where you're coming from. And I think the thing to remember is that our industry supports hundreds of thousands of households. It supports entire rural communities. So it's not something that we can just stop doing. And the one thing that maybe is important to keep in mind is the impact of technology over time. So there may be technologies out there that have not been developed yet that can help us as we move through. So some areas are experiencing rapid decline versus others. So we certainly don't want to just use up all the water that we have without thought for our future generations. And I hope that that's not the message that I portrayed, because it's certainly not the case. There is the impact of technology. There is the possibility that we can't just stop producing because we have to keep these communities going. And so I really think that if we look at where we've been, where we're going, we're doing a pretty good job, but we certainly don't want to just stop using the water because it's not economically beneficial to do so. So we have the resources, we should be able to continue to use them.
We have time for one more question. Okay, looks like we're finished for that moment. Donna, thank you again. We really appreciate you being here. And of course, we'll have more questions perhaps at the end when all the panelists are there. Okay, next we're going to welcome Margaret Lloyd. Margaret is a farm advisor for organic agriculture and small farms at the University of California Cooperative Extension, where she serves YOLO, 3 big counties, Solano and Sacramento counties. She got her PhD in plant pathology from UC Davis, and she has researched non-chemical alternatives to soil-borne disease management in strawberries and studied the level of adoption of soil-borne disease management tools among producers. Margaret, thanks so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? And you can see my screen okay?
I can't see your screen. I see you.
Oh, you can't see my screen?
No.
Just a second. Got the old screen share button. Okay, let's see. How about now?
Now it looks great. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me today and for that introduction. So I was asked to present on the motivation and obstacles to soil health practices in the area where I work, which is organic vegetable farms in Northern California. And to kick off this talk, I would like to start by reading this quote from a farmer who served on a recent committee, Sustainable Pest Management Work Group by the Pesticide Regulation. And although this is about pest management, and we're here today to talk about soil health, it reminds us of the complexities that farmers are juggling around a single subject, like pest management or soil health. And it's really challenging as researchers to hold all of these perspectives at the same time, but really critical that we keep this holistic experience of farmers in mind in our work. When we think about pest management challenges facing agriculture today, we have to consider the lack of knowledge, the lack of holistic model for a sustainable pest management farm, the lack of research into the power of healthy soil solving pest problems, the insecurity of farmers embarking on different cultural practices, the pressure from buyers for consistent quantity and quality, the peer pressure amongst farmers for fields to look a certain way, the lack of markets for organic products, the fact that many farmers are currently making a decent profit and therefore don't have incentive to change, and the ways that others are benefiting from the status quo uphold policies that preserve it. A farmer's lack of tolerance to risk, the fact that the use of pesticides for problem solving is deeply embedded in state, academia, and corporate thinking, the fact that consumers on the whole want cosmetically perfect produce at the lowest possible price and generally have an intolerance for even slightly blemished produce, the food safety issues that all farmers must be considering in their pest management choices, the fact that wholesale buyers seek farmers who can grow crops at a low price, therefore making pesticides a logical alternative over hand labor, the fact that a pest control advisor risks losing his or her farmer client if he discourages a spray that then leads to crop loss, the lack of water to grow cover crops and flush salts, the cost of equipment investment, and finally, the fact that real change takes time. So today I'll be talking about diversified organic farms in the Sacramento Valley, and I have starred the region where I work in Yolo, Solano, and Sacramento counties. And what's important about this area is that Yolo County emerged as a significant node in organic agriculture, in part because of its proximity to the San Francisco Bay Area and also UC Davis, but also because of the largely prime agricultural land, class 1 and 2 soils, and an ideal temperate climate for year-round growing. And due to a unique set of historical and ecological circumstances, the region experienced an influx of organic farmers beginning in the 1970s. And following the farm financial crisis of the 80s, land prices in the county sharply dropped. And this provided an economic window of opportunity for a new generation of farmers to insert a more ecologically minded approach to farming. Many of these farmers arrived to Yolo County relatively new to farming. They were young, educated white urbanites with the desire to farm alternatively to the industrial agribusinesses that had historically dominated the landscape of Yolo County since the early 1900s. And during this time, Yolo County, in combination with Santa Cruz County, became a significant node in the organic movement. And Yolo County became one of the few places where regulations for organic production first evolved and experimentation with organic farming first emerged. And upon their arrival, many were particularly interested in soil fertility. there was a real conscious effort to avoid mining the soil, which was a common term referred to industrial agriculture at the time, and to address ongoing issues with soil degradation in agriculture. And while initially these back to the landers lacked historically and ecologically specific knowledge of the lands they cultivated, over the last 3 decades or more, it is highly probable that they have individually amassed a wealth of local place-based knowledge of their specific management contexts and soil landscapes. And so this unique historical and ecological context makes the farmer knowledge of soil health and soil management in this region especially important to document. And this knowledge is potentially foundational as organic farmers adapt their farming approaches and management in the face of increasing social, economic, and environmental uncertainties. And so for this reason, we undertook a study to understand farmer knowledge around soil and soil management. And this is what I'll be presenting today. And so we did this by in-person and in-depth interviews that were largely open-ended and qualitative, which allowed for more unanticipated directions and avoided fitting into a framework on soil health that was chosen by the researchers. And the criteria to participate was that they grew diversified crops, they were located within Yolo County, they had at least 10 years of farming experience, and at least 5 years of farming on the same piece of ground. And then those who accepted this narrowed the pool to 13 individuals. And these individuals were mostly the primary owner and operator of the farmland. And so this study is important in that it captures the perspectives of some of the pioneers in organic vegetable production in California. And what we found in this study strongly echoes what I have seen and learned in my 8 years working closely in the field in California. This was just published, available online on Friday. So what did we learn about their motivation? Nearly all of the growers reported that they were motivated by a sense of responsibility and as part of a larger human inheritance. They described their connection to the land. And I'll put quotations that were taken from the growers of the study. I see it as a living organism. You have to be able to listen to your land. The land has its own life force, and the land sets all the rules. As a farmer, you have to be able to listen to what your land is telling you and try not to piss it off too much. They described their relationship to the land as being really critical. I belong to the land more than it belongs to me. I'm a liaison between the piece of land and the human environment. And they often expressed a romanticism for their land. I love where we are. I love my land. The land is a gift. And then this sense of responsibility. If you don't take care of the land, it won't take care of you. I feel responsible for trying to improve it and enhance it and really not to degrade it. And stewardship. So in summary, these farmers described their motivation as both a responsibility and a part of a larger human inheritance. In discussing with the farmers their knowledge of soil health and management, they were all able to very sort of mechanically and articulately describe the definition of soil health. And it had the same components that you would find in a NRCS definition, emphasizing soil organic matter, promoting biological activity, maximizing diversity, and minimizing soil disturbance. And so what was interesting to me was the next set of things that I'll share, which was how they evaluated soil health and what they saw as the key practices. First, they evaluated soil health first and foremost by plants. Farmers cited using their crops as their foremost indicator for gauging optimum soil health. Learning to look at the plants, if the color green, a particular leaf goes from shiny to matte. These are the cues that they're looking for. They're studying the habit of weeds, whether that's on the edges of their field or in the middle of the field. Is there a difference between what's happening around the edges and what's happening in the field? And interestingly, cover crops played a really important role in soil health. So I remember in a way that just staggered me when in the mid-2000s, we had micro sprinklers on some land that we were sharecropping. And they had spent all this money on a micro sprinkler system. You could see in the fall, the first fall, the ring that the micro sprinkler was irrigating. The cover crop we had planted, the cover crop wasn't growing in that ring, even though the area was wetter. These were rings of salt toxic soil because the micro sprinklers had such a high rate of evaporation. The salinity was worse there, but it was because of the cover crops that we learned what was happening. And growers independently provided numerous examples of how they used cover crops as ways to evaluate the soil health status of different fields and new fields and fields in rotation. The second most cited soil health metric was the presence and absence of soil biology. So they're looking for biology. They're looking for earthworms, arthropods, fungi as an indicator of soil health. They want to be able to pick up the soil and see life in it. And third, soil structure and soil crumble were flagged as good physical indicators of soil health. And they're determining structure based on the behavior of the soil while moving a tractor through it, by touching it, by digging small holes and looking at the vertical profile and observing how water drains in a field. Soil tests were not seen as a tool used for soil health. Most of them did not rely on them and felt that they were not able to provide them with additional information that they couldn't gather through observation. When asked about, or through the conversations, key practices emerged to building soil health. And that was maintaining soil structure, so practices that maintain soil structure, and minimizing external inputs. Working the ground during appropriate windows of soil moisture. So basically, when things are too wet, you ruin your soil. When things are too dry, you ruin your equipment. There's this little space in between that lasts about 45 minutes when you can actually get out there and do things just right. And probably the only time I ever used the word sin in my life has to do with working ground. That is where you would call sinning, where you're out working the ground and it's just too wet to be worth. And it's a sin because the damage you can do is, talk about 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Working the ground too wet is 1 step forward, 5 steps back. You're doing something that's just a real no-no. And importantly, working the ground without appropriate soil structure results in observed nutrients getting locked up in the soil. Root growth was inhibited, and the presence or absence of the presence of earthworms was diminished. So the importance of timing soil management windows was really critical, and that a big challenge was learning these key windows, and that takes a lot of time and accrued local experience. As one farmer put it, and this was echoed by numerous farmers, the soils themselves are not challenging. The challenge is learning about them. The second key practice was minimizing external inputs. For me, this was interesting and kind of caught me off guard. I see growers transitioning to animals and cover crops, but I hadn't quite connected it to this soil health component. So they talked about not relying on these external inputs such as yard waste and pellets and guano and nitrogen-based fertilizers. And so regular rotation crops was essential for soil management and for building soil organic matter. And figuring out how to rely on these better. So because when you're a small scale and you have a lot of demand for your product, it's a really hard decision to do any cover crops because you're sacrificing your income and sales. So deciding to set aside a quarter of the farm to recover crops was a difficult decision. You're making an investment in the soil and it has associated costs. But over the long term, it's clear. all of our land that we've been cover cropping and composting over the years, the yields have increased dramatically. And it really is about this long game. So in organic agriculture, you're in it for the long haul. You don't get a quick fix. And that thinking about fallowing a field, which I think of not as passive fallowing, but proactive fallowing. The initial contribution like cover cropping or application of compost for me is way more about the microbial population density than it is about NPK. And so the ability to get away from compost has been pivoting towards animals. And this was largely to be able to eliminate compost, which many growers complained had increased trash and plastic, and the overall quality of the material was poor. And so they were looking for other ways to be getting organic matter and nitrogen. And the simplest way to do this was to pivot towards this integrated crop livestock system, using chicken, sheep, and cow rotations as part of their fertility program. And so they are still seeing themselves and treating their operations as vegetable farms, and they're orienting their entire operation as these farms, but they're integrating these animals. And they did not call themselves integrated crop livestock systems. Rather, they are rotating animals through. Lastly, how do farmers gain their knowledge of soil management? And that can help us understand how to conduct our extension programming. More than half of the farmers interviewed maintained that no guidebook or manual for farming exists, and that while books were viewed as a valuable tool, to farm required knowledge that could only be gained through experience. All of them did regular experimentation, and direct observation was key. By watching other farmers, I really mean I just drive around and look, I see what tools they're using, etc. And inherited wisdom. So direct contact and conversation with older mentors played a significant part in learning for most of the farmers. So farmer knowledge formation in all of our conversations were systematic and iterative in approach. In this study, farmer ecological knowledge was developed over time based on continuous systematic observation, personal experiences, and/or experimentation. And this systematic approach that relies on iterative feedback to learning applied among these organic farmers is akin in approach to examples of adaptive management in agriculture. And for me as an extension professional, I think about how can I take their primary methods of learning and integrate that into my extension programming. And many of these things we already do, but I think it highlights the importance of keeping them in our research and extension methods. So coupling scientific knowledge with experiential knowledge, access to on-farm in-field experiments, collaborating with farmers for experiments, the importance of hands-on demonstrations and materials, and thinking about farmer-led and farmer-authored components. So in conclusion, the farmers were largely motivated by a sense of responsibility and as a part of the larger human inheritance, their connection to the land. They learned by direct experience, observation, experimentation, and inherited wisdom. And they largely relied on plants, the presence or absence of biology and soil structure. And they were very concerned and interested in their practices that maintained soil structure and minimized external inputs. So from this, we can extract barriers that are always going to be place-based, but some of those include simple things like poor compost quality, our ability to implement cover crops, and the opportunity to do some of these practices based on the timing and appropriate windows. Do we know all those windows well? Do we have cover crop research that explores all those windows and opportunities? Barriers also include our ability to extend research findings and provide educational materials in a method that is best learnt by growers, the direct experience, observation, experimentation, and inherited wisdom. How can we understand and use the connection to the land and the sense of responsibility to soil health that is felt by farmers? What do farmers need to improve that connection and relationship? Considering our research, tools, and training around those farmer soil health metrics, how are we using and developing tools that are based on measuring plants, soil biology, and soil structure that are easy to access by farmers? Do we have alternatives to our external inputs for soil organic matter and nutrients, like the animal rotations and cover crops already being used? To consider management that damages soil structure. So in general, in conclusion, this study for me has provided a shift in how I can approach research tools and education on the subject of soil health so that it is more meaningful and useful for farmers. And I hope this has also been able to enhance your understanding of the motivations and barriers to soil health adoption. Thank you.
Margaret, thank you. That was a very informative presentation, and I appreciate it on behalf of the committee. We will take some questions now from the committee, and I see any hands raised. Yes, okay. Yeah.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. I work with farmers here in Montana, and a lot of them are converting from conventional to more regenerative practices. And they seem to all be focused on adding biology to the soil. That is kind of a silver bullet, you know, and that's my concern, because they're using a lot of money on inoculant, and I don't think it's necessarily high quality, or it's not. We don't know what the quality is. And have you experienced that with your farmers at all? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really echoes this. They're very connected to the biology of the soil and understand that it has this really important role. And so I see them really grabbing for all sorts of things that can help build the biology. And
my point is that the biology is there. You just have to feed it, right? And adding just something is not going to solve the problem. I was also struck that the group of farmers that you work with seem to be really educated already and observant. And how do you think it would be different had you done the same survey with conventional farmers, or, you know, outside this 13 group that, you know, was kind of maybe self-selected?
Oh yeah, that's a very good question. I'm not so sure. I think, you know, these growers are also diversified growers to begin with, and so they're managing these complex rotations, and that probably helps support integrating multiple practices that are a part of soil health. So I'm not sure. I suspect that probably the learning components would be pretty similar. So using observation, experimentation, inherited wisdom would be really similar. And I also think that they're probably using similar metrics, looking at plants, looking at structure, and looking for biology. So yeah, now that I'm thinking about it, I think it would be very similar, but maybe where they're at with their sort of understanding of, you know, the drivers and mechanisms might be at a different place. It's also so place-based, you know, how the soils and the climate and the crop rotations, that you're going to see that natural type of variation. But yeah, I think the framework is maybe interestingly translatable, but the details will be unique.
Carlotta.
Thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. It struck me that the influence of the interpersonal connections, right? Like the trusted voices, and as you termed it, inherited wisdom was quite important for the practices that your study population is currently putting in place. And I was thinking about wondering what the next steps of your work are, and if you're looking to expand, to find ways to expand these more sustainable practices to other regions, and if you might use that impact, that influence of the trusted voice to do that.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I think that's exactly it. I think about, I work within this context as an extension professional. So how can I maybe help facilitate some of those relationships? How can I bring that voice to more public tables, instead of it being, friends and neighbors talking to each other? How can we bring some of those expert voices to maybe larger gatherings? Or how can we document some of those conversations that normally happen, in a field, in a paper that can be read by other farmers? So trying to think more about these farmer authored, farmer led type opportunities that I, as an extension professional, can help facilitate, so that the voice can go further. I think there's certainly an effort to make these like hubs where you have smaller groups meeting around the state, these demonstration hubs. And I think those are trying to kind of capture the local voice in a way that other farmers can be invited to, and sort of get access to that farmer knowledge through like a hub network, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Are there some other questions? Well, we can take one more question if you've got one, or we can hold it to the end. Okay, thank you, Margaret. That was really good. Appreciate
Thank
that.
you.
Okay, our final speaker for today, but not all the questions, is Eugene Kelly. Gene's a professor of podology and deputy director of the Colorado Experiment Station. He's also associate dean for extension in the College of Agriculture at Colorado State University. His work has contributed to major breakthroughs in understanding soil formation, the role of plants in soil evolution, and the place of soils in global and climate change research. He serves as an advisor to the United States Department of Agriculture with the National Cooperative Soil Survey, and is a fellow of the Soil Science of America. Gene, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. Let me make sure I got everything here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, but work on your screen. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Your screen is showing the next.
Hold on a second.
We need to see the whole thing.
Okay, so can you see all my slides there?
Yes, we can see all your slides.
Not doing that. Okay.
There you go.
Is that better?
That's better.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody.
It's back to President.
What's going on?
I can.
Let me try one more time.
Go down to the bottom, and that. What I see is a little.
Is it on the Zoom thing? What am I doing here?
If you click the three dots right there where your mouse is, the three dots in the circle, nope, two to over. Yep, and then just click hide presenter view.
Excellent.
Oh, and I think you need to switch your screen. So you have two screens, because I think it must just be on your opposite screen.
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay.
Nope.
Oh, it's still presenter view.
Let me see. I presenter view.
Eric, do you have any advice?
Let me see.
You set it for mirror, at least you won't have a presenter view.
Presenter view. Let's just do that. Check. What, you guys don't see my slides now? You see my three sons? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
I was just admiring. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'll do that. That's good. Great idea. Okay. Oh, I see. So that will be this one.
Green one.
Now you guys can see yourselves, right?
Oh, there you go.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. I apologize. Anyway, well, thank you for having me this afternoon. Upon the recommendation of the committee, I've been asked to present a bit about some of the perspective of integrating, specifically was looking at precision and decision agriculture. So I thought I would broaden the perspective a bit. I want to preface this that I am not an expert in artificial intelligence nor decision agriculture, but I do utilize a lot of the technology and tools. And so I thought I would present sort of the perspective from somebody who does soils work, but actually is looking to integrate some of the technological opportunities that we have. I think the major thing with the soil health issue regarding just broadly is that we need to broaden our views of what soil health is. And I understand that the work the committee has been doing is really outstanding. That's not just carbon, it's about PFAS, it's about a lot of other things that are in soils, biodiversity and such. One of the things I wanted to highlight was some work we're doing on strategic utilization of soils, actually using soils to map against practices and using practices that are appropriate for different types of soils. I'll talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and what we call decision and precision ag. And I'll finish up on something called climate-informed agriculture, which is really integrating the technology to some of the basic knowledge we have about soil science and utilization of practices to enhance soil health. In incorporating the technology and some of the things I'll show this afternoon, it really deals with matching practices to environment. And I think the previous speakers pointed out that context is really important and that the issues with soil health in the Northeastern United States are very different than what we see in the Southwest and really vary across environments. Much of the work is to reduce the physical disturbance we see in soils. We know that soil erosion is a major or has a major impact on soil health and productivity. One of the things that we can do with precision ag and decision ag is really enhance our nutrient stewardship in terms of being able to sort of manage more effectively the way that we add amendments to soils. One of the real benefits of incorporating the technology is to reduce the addition of chemicals to the soils. That not only provides a reduction of chemicals added to the soils, but it also reduces the exposure of our stakeholders and farmers to the use of chemicals for their practices. And of course, I think what we're really trying to do with regard to soil health is really improve the resiliency or have increased climate resiliency in our agricultural systems. I thought I'd start off with the issue that we deal with a lot is the idea of soil carbon and what we call the soil health conundrum, and that there's been an enormous focus just on carbon. And we understand that there's a much broader perspective. We understand the role of agriculture in the production of greenhouse gases. And what we really understand is that the sequestering potential of soils is really variable and actually quite low and doesn't add up to the amount of losses that we have. We are promoting the activity of carbon neutrality in agriculture. And once that's accomplished, then sequestration is possible. And of course, we really want to avoid the moral hazard for policymakers. And fossil fuel emissions are not tolerable. And we need to make sure that that becomes a sort of, I think, a messaging from the scientific community. One of the major things that we do in the West, and was pointed out by my colleagues previously, is that, moisture and soil water is really, really, really important in terms of soil health, and promoting activities that enhance soil moisture is of the utmost importance. This is not only water management and utilization in our agricultural systems, but also in our natural systems. And what we know globally is that non-ag water consumes about 3/4 of the global green water flow. That's soil water. And the remaining 1/4 is partitioned between croplands and pasture lands through irrigation. So irrigation management becomes really critical, and I'll show you some things about that. The flow of green water accounts for 65% of the total flow of any water, green or blue, around the world. But I think what becomes really interesting is when you look at the global green water, that's the water lost through transpiration globally, it equals the rivers flowing into the oceans and suggests that one of the largest reservoirs of water that we manage in agriculture is the water that's in our soil. And so I'll talk about a bit of our research that focuses on this key aspect, and then I'll go right into the use of precision and decision agriculture. So here's my favorite picture. This is for Diana, just a soil profile that you all stood in front of. And what we do in pedology is provide characterization and understand really what the foundational, the framework is for using different agricultural practices that enhance soil health. We have a biogeochemical layer and a geochemical layer. And what I'm going to focus on more is a little bit of the hydrological variability and behavior of soils. Again, in the West, where water is limiting and limits much of our activity and productivity in agricultural soils, we are trying to use information that we already have available, not only in our research universities, but also in the NRCS database. And that these data and the use of big data can be really, really important in looking at what practices are most appropriate in which parts of the country. The next schematic is a research project we have where we're measuring soil water across different types of soils. In the schematic, you'll see something that says old, young, intermediate, and old. And that's not ages of people, that's ages of soils, although we have a lot of old soil scientists in the country. But these are different age soils. And what we know from monitoring soil across different environments is that even in a landscape that seems pretty uniform across a geographical area or a visual landscape, in the three phases of soils, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, we see very different hydrological behaviors and properties. And in this particular case, the phase 2 soil has a higher capacity to hold water than both phase 1 and phase 3. So this would imply that if we were going to manage soils, we'd have to think of these systems very differently, although they're really within the same general area. So what we're trying to show is that the physical and biological properties of soils are really, really important, and understanding those to implement the appropriate soil health practices is really key. This is just a follow-up to that figure where we broke down the soil profiles, and you can see different ages of soils in the right panel, the variability and water holding capacity within each of the layers of the soils. And again, the figure on the left, looking at the different soils where you have in phase 2, the optimal amount of biological variable water holding capacity, as opposed to what we see in the phase 1 and the phase 3 systems. And so you could take data like these and you can actually map this out. And so what we've done is we've taken the soils data from the work we've done and the soil survey data, and we can map soil moisture. And this is being mapped against historical records across the entire Great Plains. But it becomes a really powerful tool for utilizing soils, strategically using soils that have the capacity to be more productive or increase intensification, as opposed to soils that are marginal and don't have the capacity to hold water. So this is just one example of the modeling that we've used in our research to help us, quote unquote, map practice to the conditions that we see in each of the soils. Okay, so I'm going to move to some observations and work that we're doing in terms of artificial intelligence. If you're not familiar with the Western U.S., this is the Colorado River Basin, beautiful area to work in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some of the research we've been doing over here in Western Colorado. Again, the Colorado River Basin has become sort of a under the eyes of people looking globally at the management of water and agricultural production. We test all these technologies at what we call the Colorado Agricultural Observatory. This is a schematic of our research centers across the state. You can see there are 10 research centers going from Eastern Colorado Research Center up in the far right upper corner of the figure to the southwest. And they all possess very different agricultural systems. And so in terms of soil health and mapping soil health, we have really, really different agricultural practices. And we're going to try to use different types of technology to map practice versus the types of soils we have. So for example, up in Eastern Colorado, we have mostly livestock systems. We're really interested in the impacts of grazing on soil health practices and how we can use technology to help us there. Someplace like the San Luis Valley, down in the center of the picture, where we produce amazing potatoes, second largest exporter of potatoes in North America, by the way. We are very interested in potato production and soil health practices for those areas. So in the observatory, we're really into climate-informed ag. We manage against biological invasions, water management. We have community food programs, and of course, soil health practices. One of the major practices that we've instituted across the Western U.S. is really in terms of the way we provide water to our soils. And so this is an example of what we call a linear irrigation system. And this replaces some of the systems we've had previously that were more flood irrigated or side rolls. And right off the bat, what this does is it reduces the soil erosion and chemical runoff that we apply water directly to the surface of the soil. When we use flood irrigation, or our stakeholders use flood irrigation, we lose 60 to 7% of the topsoil every time we irrigate. So just managing water differently provides an enormous benefit to promoting soil health activities. In addition, when you have less runoff, your edge of field monitoring basically suggests that we get less chemical runoff. Again, so looking at not only the impacts on the soil, but also on the individuals living nearby in terms of water contamination or those issues. So in terms of the artificial intelligence work that we do, we really look at intelligent sensors and how those are used to basically help us devise management strategies and first and foremost, monitor what's going on in the system. So we can do crop monitoring. We can have AI hooked to our different equipment. We collect environmental data. The decision-making can also be driven by big data and models. And of course, using any kind of attenuation to sort of map and design the best management strategies that we have for our agricultural systems. So this is a schematic coming up of one of our research centers. This is over in the Grand Valley in the Colorado River Basin. And so what we've been able to do is to take the entire farm and instrument it with different types of sensors that are driven by AI technologies. And I'll point out some of those in a second. But the linear that I talked about was in the green field H, and the linear moves across that field. We can provide water strategically to any part of the field based on the crops. So you might say, well, Gene, how do you know what's going on with the crops? Well, what we can do is we can look at not only the direct, but the indirect impacts of what we're doing. So for example, soil health practices at multiple scales can be assessed using different types of technology. So up in the upper left-hand portion of this photograph, we have drone-based precision chemical sprayers. And in this particular field, what we can do is we can actually program the drone to spray weeds in certain types of the field or certain parts of the fields. Again, what this does is it allows a more precision application of chemicals, but also reduces the risks of farmers having to be out in the field doing this. So they're doing this from a distance or remotely. We have automated harvesting techniques, which again reduce the activity of people in the fields. The two that I find the most interesting are the plant health identification parameters, which are, again, new technologies. And then this other one on the bottom, which is a really strange looking instrument, is actually weed locating. So what you can do is you can scan or program this machine as solar powered. It will walk across the field and it will actually clip weeds as it walks across the field based on an image that you put into the program. So again, these are highly precise amendments that we're making to fields based on this instrumentation. All of these are mostly solar powered. Again, they provide an enormous amount of precision to where we're adding chemicals and amending pests and pathogens in the field. Finally, one of the things that we've been working closely on is looking at monitoring and using different types of monitors, both thermal and multispectral models. And this is a multispectral image of the productivity across that field that I just showed you. And what this does is it allows us to monitor the plants and decide where to add water, where to add fertilizer, where to add pesticides. So you won't be adding it uniformly across the field. You'd be adding it strategically in different aspects of the field based on productivity, thermal properties. This is more of a spectral image, but this was equated with some of the productivity that we saw across the field. So again, looking at different types of yield monitors and equipment like that. Some of the work that we're doing in Colorado is not just on agricultural soils, and that soil health is a really important parameter across the entire state. So not only our agricultural soils, but our forest soils, which are part of our agricultural system. Doing soil health and diverse ecosystems requires us to look at the geomorphology, variations in soils and cultural practices, hydrologic regimes, and also the land cover, for example, urban versus agricultural systems. So we spend an enormous amount of time not only looking at urban culture fields or agricultural fields, but also in urban systems. One of the areas that we've spent a lot of time on is actually dust collection. I think one of our speakers earlier talked about the increasing amount of dust that we see in the atmosphere. And we've established automated sampling procedures and techniques across a broad environmental gradient from the Colorado Plateau out into the eastern grasslands of Colorado. This is a part of an NSF project. It's called the One Health AeroBiome project, where we're actually looking at the composition of the dust samples that we're collecting across these broad environmental gradients. And this would be everything from microbiome to plastics to heavy metals and those sorts of things. So again, dust becomes a really important parameter, and we can actually monitor dust generation and dust collection fairly precisely with some of our instrumentation and advanced technology. We're taking advantage of existing networks, for example, the COAG network and NEON, to look at the use of computations at sensors. As many of you know, when you start monitoring things in the field and you want to use AI, you need an enormous amount of these data to make any sort of computations or modeling. So we can do things and make continuous measurements across very broad environmental gradients. The next schematic shows a climate and soil moisture monitoring across the entire state of Colorado, where we're creating a network of networks looking at real-time measurements of soil moisture across not only agricultural sector, but also across natural resources and urban areas. What you notice in Colorado is there's a real deficiency in our agricultural areas. Most of the monitoring is by the SNOTEL network, which is up in the mountains above an elevation of about 8,000 feet. So it really doesn't do a lot of good for us. So expanding our soil moisture monitoring to the agricultural sector is a really important aspect of this. And then finally, the thing I wanted to sort of highlight a bit more was the idea of soil science and big data, and the use of data science to help us not only monitor what's going on within our soils and ecosystems, but also to help us forecast what's going on. If we know what the soil properties are, we can incorporate spectral data using data sciences and modeling techniques to create not only environmental forecasting, but also taking the appropriate soil health practices and mapping those to different types of soils that we're, the diversity of soils that we see, particularly in a place like Colorado. I'm getting close to the end here. So finally, one of the things we've been working on with this idea of strategic utilization of soils and incorporating technology is being able to really look at the variability of soils in terms of topography and wetness and soil water holding capacity. This work helps us place sensors and monitoring systems in different locations, and not only in our agricultural systems, but also in our natural systems as well. When I looked at the group of people on this call, I noticed many of you were sort of oriented toward the microbiome. I know Diana, for example, in terms of microbial ecology and being ecosystem scientists. And I think one of the benefits of being able to look at the strategic utilization of soils and being able to map properties of soils spatially and mapping practice with PROPIS is to really look at things like the microbiome and aspects of the microbial communities. And we know that these maps have been made at very, very, very large scales. They provide an enormous amount of information, but the move in incorporating technology and increasing sensor technology and AI capabilities will allow us to do more localized mapping. So it'll provide the foundation for not only for soil health, but I think enhancing and increasing human health capabilities. So I think I will leave it there. I'm up to almost 18 minutes.
Thank you, Gene. Let's take a couple of questions if you have them for Gene on his presentation, and then we'll go to questions for the whole group of speakers this afternoon. If we can see back to the faces. There we go. Does anybody have questions on this? My first question is, this looks expensive for the type of farmers we've been talking about.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think that's one of the things I did not really get to incorporate is that, you know, I think when we talk about limitations of farmer adoption, it really is about cost in many cases. And, you know, we have a project, I think somebody pointed out earlier, the Climate Smart Commodities program, where we're actually able to get money to get farmers the appropriate sensors and actually backstop them. So we're actually passing money through the university to our stakeholders, helping us with some of the soil health practices. And so, yeah, I mean, even for the university, these become very, very expensive. And you know, the adoption of technology with farmers is interesting as well. I mean, you know, there was some report that came out and said, you know, 85% of farmers have smartphones and 60% of them have PCs, and only 25% of them have even more adoption at the farm level. So there really isn't, there are other barriers, and I think cost is probably one of the major ones. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from
I was wondering, I have a related question to the one asked by Dr. Wall, and it's whether you see any use for farmer-specific data being used as part of the data inputted into these AI algorithms.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's become a bigger part of our portfolio. In other words, that one of what we know from some of the extension work that we do out at our research centers, what we understand is that there really is the benefit of having co-creation and working with farmers on their properties and looking at the practices they're doing and trying to assess what they're doing in terms of soil behavior. They know more about the land than anybody. So I think, we've been trying to incorporate and work more closely and directly with our stakeholders. So I think that there is an enormous benefit to these data that farmers collect. And in the Climate Smart Commodities program we're instrumenting over 400 farms with soil moisture monitoring that'll all be loaded up into the cloud, and they have access to these data. And we have to be very mindful about who gets that data and how that data is released. So I think having farmers again, in Colorado, they're our best scientists. So, I think that I'm really in favor of the co-creation or, of research and different types of soil health practices.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking not only data collected by farmers, but data about, for example, the resources that a specific farmer may have, or even more delving into perhaps data generated from the qualitative information that we heard from our previous speaker.
Yeah.
About potential attitudes. And I'm in human nutrition, and I know that
Right.
A very effective strategy for behavior change is when individuals perceive the dietary advice being tailored to their specific situation. So I wondered if a similar approach could be adopted here.
Absolutely. I mean, again, I didn't encompass all that. We have people working in the community food programs that spend a bit more time looking at that, and I apologize for not mentioning that, but I do think it really is an important factor in terms of what really goes into the decision-making process for our stakeholders and adoption of these practices and technologies. Yeah.
I could just follow up one question then, and then I think we ought to open it to all the speakers today. Thanks, Donna. All of a sudden, Donna appears, and there's Margaret. But Gene, on just to follow up on Carlotta's question, are we able to get this qualitative information to kind of, that just takes another model or another decision tool to put what the farmers know qualitatively about their land, such as some of the points that and the site specific characteristics of the farm. How do we get that together with all the super tech that you're showing us?
Well, I think like I'll go back to the project of the Climate Smart Commodities. I think of any of the projects that we're looking at, it's probably one that is doesn't require a lot of heavy duty use of technology. It really is about practice based. We're not in there measuring milligrams of carbon or kilograms of carbon. So it becomes challenging because one of the things in terms of getting adoption and working closely is that some people view it as the rich getting richer. So the folks that are doing the work are the ones who are already making money are the ones who are getting more money for these programs. And so the idea is to sort of get farmers to work together. And so we have rating systems, and there is a little bit of this idea of the lead stakeholders. And when lead stakeholders adopt technology, the word gets out to the community. This is the first time in my whole career when I'm out in Eastern Colorado where farmers walk up to me and say, "Hey, how can I get into that STAR program?" It's never happened before, ever, So, I think that's an important thing. But yeah, I think the qualitative data, I think we have a relatively, we know who's doing what where, but in terms of, perceptions and things, Diana, I don't know if we really understand that fully yet. Yeah.
Okay, let's open it up for some other questions and any discussion we might have. Questions for Donna, Margaret, or Gene? And I should say that will help our report or inform our report. Sarah.
Hi, yeah. I had a question for Dr. Lloyd. And I guess it's a pair of questions. I was curious if you could tell us, unless I might have just missed it, but what was the size of the farms that you interviewed in your study? And if you could speak a little bit about their relationship to reducing soil disturbance. I was struck by their approach to maintaining soil structure, all about working the soil in appropriate windows. And I realizing that these are mixed vegetable farms and the importance of tillage in those systems. I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about your takeaways in that space.
Yeah, so to answer your first question about scale, you're right, I didn't mention that. So these farms range from 40 acres to 900 acres, with the average being probably 200 to 400. And then the disturbance question. So there are a couple of farmers who were part of this study, but who are part of a larger study with several farmers in California who are organic vegetable farmers trying to figure out the no-till system in the organic vegetable system. And it's been extremely challenging. So I think they're making efforts and working with researchers to try to adopt a no-till, minimum till system, but so far it's proven to be extremely difficult. So I regularly see their experiments that they're doing either on their own or in collaboration, trying to do, strip tillage or different interplanting rotations with animals to try to reduce disturbance. But yeah, they're definitely highly in the experimental phase of cracking that nut.
Thank you. Cool.
Yeah, and Jeff Mitchell has been leading the research project. If you want to look into it, it's the report might be available for that.
Rebecca has a question.
Yeah, thanks. So Margaret highlighted the importance of learning among farmers in a context, and I was just kind of willing to guess that farmers in Texas or Colorado or California are somewhat, distinct in their distinct enclaves and communication bubbles or whatever, like everybody else. And I'm wondering what you see as mechanisms to kind of create cross-learning among different types of farmers or different regions, so that the insights of and worldviews can sort of, is there any chance that could work, or are people trying to do that?
Let's see what all three of them have to say. Donna?
I think that's something that we do here at Texas Tech. So we have a group of growers that we work with called the Texas Alliance for Water Conservation. It's a demonstration project. And we educate these growers on the latest technologies, but we send them to conferences. We bring people down. We use producer panels, the whole producer teaching producers thing. We use that to educate them. And so I know from the TAWC perspective, that's something that we work on with them, at least for here. I'm sure it's the same in Colorado and California.
Okay, let's ask Margaret, and then we'll ask Gene.
Yeah, so the farmers in this study and that I largely work with are not part of a commodity crop, so to speak, and so they don't have a similar sort of industry support. That said, in California, we do have a couple of conferences that are grower-centric based on organic production, such as the Organic Grower Summit or the Ecological Farming Association. And so those become educational opportunities that are largely West California and West Coast dominated. When I talk to my growers about how they learn new things, the number one resource is the internet as like a general tool, and they're watching YouTube. It's kind of amazing how they're meeting farmers by watching YouTube. So people who are posting videos and are accessible through Instagram and the internet are having the strongest impact on reaching growers who are not within their social network.
That's how I learned too. Just
Let's see
Yeah.
what Gene says, okay? Is yours different in Colorado?
Yeah, well, I mean, we have the same setup. I mean, every one of those research centers I showed has an advisory group, and they're usually tied to a commodity. For example, in the Western Slope, peach growers or the wine industry, Eastern Colorado. Livestock is our major, our major agricultural industry. I think we have a reasonably good community. I think what becomes evident is this sort of, I think farmers want to be recognized and heard. And we have lots of those venues here at CSU. I mean, we have, multiple meetings across the entire state, and we bring all the advisory groups in. And I think that's what it is. I think that they have an enormous amount of knowledge about what's working and what's not working. And we've just gotten better. I think we've gotten better at listening to them and really understanding some of the limitations. I mean, I had a farmer back about a year ago. I was down in the San Luis Valley again, where we produced great potatoes. But he walked up to me one night and he said, "Hey," he goes, "My dad, how many crops my dad grew in the 1940s?" I said, "How many?" He said, 15. So you know how many I grow now? I said, "What?" He goes, 2. And he looked at me and he goes, "We have to change that." And I think for a farmer to recognize that is really, really important, right? In terms of they really understand what we need in our landscapes and the way to manage agriculture. So, and they're very cognizant of soil health. I mean, they're really, really on top of it. And like, I think you're right. They get everything from the internet or consultants. And we work quite closely with consultants. We work like almost arm in arm with them with our extension program and try to bring them on board when we have training sessions and things. Yeah.
Thank you all. Any other questions? Yes, go ahead, Yoka.
Yeah, this might be so broad to be even useful, but I mean, obviously, this report is about thinking about ways to improve soil health through management practices and other aspects. And we've thought about circularity, and it relates to what you were saying, Jean, about how do we promote crop diversity? How do we, incorporate farm animals? And it just seems so large, that problem. So I'm curious, within each of your fields and where you're working in your system, what is the biggest obstacle you see for promoting soil health, or for farmers to adopting practices that can promote soil health? And yeah, I guess I'll stop there. It's a little overwhelming, I think. I don't know who wants to start.
I was going to let Donna go first.
I can. I think from my perspective, what I see is that we deal with an issue of farmer identity. And so we have farmers who, I farm cotton, and that's what I do. That's what my dad did. That's what my daddy's dad did. And that's what, this is what I do. I farm cotton. I do not ranch. And so as our water resources are declining, we're seeing this natural transition out of irrigated agriculture. So historically, areas that are producing corn are now shifting to irrigated cotton, and then into dryland cotton, and then into more integrated livestock cropping systems. And I think it's a struggle to get producers to think of themselves as a rancher and a farmer. And so I think for us that, farmers are a heterogeneous bunch, and, they've got different, depending on age, I think, right? They have different characteristics depending on, age and kind of where they're from. And so I think for us, it's an issue of identity, because I farm monoculture cotton, and that's what I do. And so getting them to break out of that mental habit is tough.
Yeah, I think it's, we sort of use the word, that we'll move progressively, we move at the speed of trust, right? Like, so how much do they really trust us, right? And I think that is becoming sort of more evident and obvious. We have I would say the farmers that we have that are, sort of mid-career and above actually trust us more than some of the newer farmers. Although the newer farmers, they'll come in and try stuff, but a lot of it isn't research-based. They just go out and try to do their own thing, like, again, from the internet. And, you know, in Colorado, one of the big contrasts, I'm sure in California, it's the same thing, Margaret, is that you have the different, you know, kinds of growers, right? We have our organic industry and we have the small scale farmers here on the Front Range. And of course, our large commodity producers, wheat growers and livestock people, and they're really just from different cultures, really. I mean, they do not talk to each other, right? And so, but they all talk to us, which is, you know, which becomes challenging. But I think that's a big thing too. Yeah.
Margaret, do you have a comment?
Sure. So, you know, I have the advantage in that a lot of my growers are already bought in to the subject, right? They're motivated from a sort of stewardship standpoint. And so with that sort of piece taken care of, I think the actual implementation is challenging. Cover cropping has risks. And like many of them echoed, there's a cost associated with it that you're not going to get back immediately. And you may not see the benefits immediately. And so even when you're bought into it, the cost of implementing these practices that are slow to see and that take time to build up is a big challenge. Yeah. And we also haven't brought up land ownership as a component to a willingness to invest in soil health practices. Oh. And that's a major factor. A lot of growers don't own their land and have shorter leases. And so the willingness to invest this money in a piece of land that you don't own can be an immediate barrier.
Right. And then the switching of ownership, then you lose the legacy of that too, when somebody comes in and leases land and they're moving around. So that's a big problem here too, Margaret, the lack of, you know, we have a lack of stewardship. Yeah.
And it seems also to me like a lack of recognition of the other services that you get from healthier soil that is currently not rewarded, at least not immediately. Obviously, the farmers will see the benefit over time with higher yield, but in terms of carbon sequestration and purifying water and circulating nutrients. So do you see any ways to incorporate a reward for those?
Well, I mean, you know, one of the things with Climate Smart Commodities, this big program that the Secretary had funded, was that, you know, we're not monetizing carbon. We're not going, I mean, we have 3% of our farmers are prescribing to, you know, the voluntary markets. So nobody's buying that story yet. But what we think is paying for practice. So if somebody uses cover crops, regardless, because cover crops in Colorado, you know, they use water and they don't necessarily give us more carbon, but they keep the ground covered so it doesn't erode. Yeah. And in California, I've seen the research, it shows differences in where it is. Sometimes you get a carbon benefit and other times you don't, but they're covering the ground. So we should just be paying farmers for practice. We shouldn't be worrying about whether we're splitting hairs, if they're getting how much carbon they're fixing. But if they're practicing sound things that we know work, we know cover crops stop erosion or ameliorate erosion, we should do that. And I think that farmers are buying into that more here than they are the idea of making bank on a carbon market that doesn't exist. I mean, the only people making money now are the big guys that got in early. And other than that, it's fallen apart. And so I think our farmers are really excited about payment for practice and again, creating a safety net and reducing their risk. And if we can create a safety net, reduce their risk and enhance their production or production operations, then I think we gain this trust that they need to see.
And that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Any other comments, Donna or Margaret?
Sure. We have, you know, in California, there's the Healthy Soils demonstration and healthy soil practices that CDFA, the Department of Food and Agriculture, is funding for basically payments for cover cropping and compost. And it's for 3 years. And these are extremely valuable. And they're essentially taking that cost during that delay period of, let's say, 3 years away from the farmers and really helping to bridge that uncertainty and that associated cost and the trial and error period. So I think it's been a huge success in California, that program.
Okay, any more questions from the committee? Well, I would just kind of finalize before I thank you all is to say that we know where you are, so we can ask you more questions if we need to. I really want to thank you all for being here today and helping us think about our statement of task. We've got a big job and we're moving on it, but especially in regard to farmer adoption of soil health, which we just finished on. This is really important for this information gathering session we've got here. And so we're going to take the next few months to finalize our report, get a good draft, and then, revise it once it gets through the process. And as we mentioned earlier, we hope to have that out, and you'll see it in spring of, we hope, in 2024. That's what we're headed for. And if anybody wants to know more about the report's public release, you can sign up on the Board on Agriculture and Natural Resource listserv. There's a place on there you can sign up and they'll notify you. And I just want to thank you once again for helping us out on this information gathering session. It was really important. Thanks to everyone, and we'll see you later.
Thank you.